As I've mentioned in previous lectures, the power of science comes from its communal nature, the fact that science, modern science, is really a group effort, and that's where its power lies. So, the sociology of science is the study, the professional study by sociologists, not scientists, but sociologists, of how science works. How do we align individual incentives, the individual incentives that scientists like myself face, with the success of the scientific community? Because there's a tension there between individual incentives and group success. So, how does it work? That's the sociology of science. So, this being a science course, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the sociology of science, but I want to mention one of the more famous, probably the most famous sociological theory about science, and it was developed by Robert Merton, who you see here. He was a professor at Columbia University. He published in 1942 a book called The Sociology of Science, so he's kind of an authority on the subject. In short, his book, he comes up with four what he calls norms of science. These are behaviors that are internalized by scientists, and if you violate these norms, you're kicked out of the group, so to speak. So, what are they? So, the four norms of science are what you see in front of you, and we'll start with the letter U for universalism. In a nutshell, this just means that the personal attributes and social background of a person are irrelevant to the scientific value of the person's ideas. It doesn't matter how old they are, their ethnicity, their gender, if you like them or if you don't like them. You have to assess the ideas, not the person who's communicating those ideas. And so, in that sense, science is open to everyone from everywhere, universalism. Communism is not referring to the political ideology. It refers to the idea that scientific ideas and results are not owned by the scientists who discovered them, but they're kind of owned communally by the scientific community. Keeping data and results privately is frowned upon, very very frowned upon. If you just share your conclusions and not your results and not your data, and often scientists want to promote their own work, have others use it, and without anything like payment. You just have to give them credit. Uh, you know, you don't want to plagiarize, but no one's going to be asking for money every time you use someone's work. Organized skepticism is what Robert Merton called the community wide pattern of challenging and testing ideas instead of taking them on trust. The idea here is that when a scientist presents results or a conclusion of a study, we're not going to take it at face value. We're not going to say, oh, this scientist is so eminent, is so experienced, is so famous that we're just going to trust what they say. No, their results, their conclusions are going to be scrutinized just like any other scientist. Uh, the data will be looked at. Their arguments are going to be scrutinized, looking for cracks in their arguments. Are there other ways to interpret the data? Their methods will be scrutinized. Were these appropriate methods? Were there ways that their methods could have biased or influenced their results in a way that the scientists are not considering? We call this, the general word for this kind of organized skepticism is peer review. And a lot of what we scientists do is essentially reviewing the work of other scientists, often in an anonymous and unpaid fashion. Disinterestedness. Well, the basic idea here is that scientists are supposed to act for the benefit of the common scientific enterprise rather than personal gain. Now, this was Robert Merton writing in 1942, and I think of all these norms, the one that has been most challenged is the norm of disinterestedness, because very often we have scientists acting in manners that are completely unethical, I mean, by any standard, to further their own interest, be that fame or generally it's financial rewards, and there's many different examples we won't get into, but as a ideal, disinterestedness is certainly an ideal that scientists want to strive towards. Robert Merton also talked in his book about the reward system in science, and this is really getting at again rectifying or trying to square the circle between individual incentives that scientists face and the communal good. And so, what Robert Merton said is that the basic currency of scientific rewards is recognition. And I specifically, it's recognition as the first person to come up with an idea. So we can think of, Boyle's law or Darwinian evolution. That's a recognition that scientists really strive towards. Now, most scientists are not going to come up with groundbreaking, earth shattering ideas, but they'll come up with small advances. And so, when we talk about recognition, we're not talking about being on the cover of Bop magazine or anything like that, not worldwide, Nobel Prize winning recognition, but recognition also within a small community of people who work on detailed problems. So, you can think of, for example, my community would be agronomists in Eastern Canada. That's maybe 15 to 20 people, professional agronomists that are doing academic research, not working agronomists. But even that, when you consider all that, that might be, a couple thousand people at most. So, we're not necessarily talking about world fame here, but recognition. Now, one of the best ways to provide recognition in science is citation when you refer to someone's work. That means you're using someone's research without doing it yourself. And that means you trust those results, you trust that work. So, using someone's research results is a form of recognition highly valued by scientists. And in addition, as when you're doing your own work, you need to give citations and build on the work done by others. If you're not citing work that you should be, that can be fraudulent, and it can be actually quite a crime. And if you start um, using work without citing it, or citing it as your own work, that destroys trust in science. So the desire to have one's work used generates many beneficial features in science. Uh, and the reward system, again, this is what is allowing individual incentives. Farmers' quest for recognition for scientific achievement generates this communal level good. So naturally, there are going to be, and there are, tensions between individual incentives and community level success. A classic one would be if you're a scientist at a university, but you're also an investor in a company, or you're an inventor and you hold a patent on some product, and you decide to study and publish research about how effective this product is. Does it cure the disease? Does it increase yields? And that's not frowned upon necessarily to do research where you have a financial interest in the results, but you need to state it up front. So often there's a requirement when you publish research that you have a financial interest in, you have to state that up front. Um, Now, what's completely worse than that is if you do commit fraud. So that's if you're making up results, if you're just completely fabricating data, again, normally for a financial benefit of some kind. Um, Not only is it a financial, or not only will fraud be done sometimes for financial reasons, for a scientist to make more money, but there's also what Robert Merton called a mania to publish. So, because citations are so valuable, and because universities often promote scientists based on the number of publications they have, scientists are going to want to publish lots and lots of research papers. And at some point, some scientists might begin to feel like, what, I'm not publishing enough papers. I'm just going to completely fabricate up some data. I'm just going to like completely lie and make up an experiment and write it up as if I did it. This happens rarely, but it absolutely has happened. And so there's absolutely tensions between individual and community success. There's also what I've experienced in my own relatively short career at this point is um, when peer reviewers ask you to cite their own papers. So when you submit a paper to a journal, uh, you have an anonymous peer reviewer that reviews the work and uh, gives you suggestions or tells the editor to accept or reject the paper. If there's some fundamental flaw, then it'll be kind of an automatic rejection from the paper, as not it's not suitable, it's not high quality science. But often there'll be minor comments. So the reviewer will say, I recommend publication, but here are some small suggestions. And sometimes they'll suggest, I suggest you cite this paper and this paper and this paper, and it's all the same author. And the papers don't have anything to do with the study you're writing up. It doesn't have anything to do with your research, but that scientist wants to get more citations, and they're essentially asking you to cite themselves. That I feel is, I feel like that's a gray area, but it's something about I've experienced where peer reviewers are asking me to cite research, which has nothing to do with the research paper, under review. So they're just gaming the system at that point. I want to end this very short lecture with a quote by philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith. And what he says is here is basically that, to the extent that science is a strategy for answering questions and working out what to believe, it can be carried out by individuals working alone. But what makes science so powerful is the cumulative and coordinated efforts of multiple individuals building on previous work and organizing its energies via collaboration and public discussion. This social organization permits the scientific strategy to function at the level of social groups. I read this, I couldn't have said it better myself, and so I'm citing Professor Godfrey Smith here. In summary, this is what I want you to take away from the lecture. You have to understand the fundamental tension that the sociological study of science is trying to understand. Understand what Robert Merton considers the key currency of rewards in science, and understand the four norms of science according to Robert Merton.